Walter Briggs inherited a feed store worth $2,100. The county took the rest. 42 acres, 3 silos, and 30 years of his father's work, assessed and closed on a Tuesday while Walter was driving home. He came back anyway, every morning, for 11 years. What he found at the bottom of Silo 3 had been sitting in the dark since 1987. The man who put it there had known who would find it. At 67, after the county of Hale closed the estate and divided what remained of Earl Briggs's life into 3 equal parts on paper, Walter Briggs walked out of the Plainview courthouse with $2,100, a deed to 42 acres of cracked hardpan, and a set of keys his father had mailed to him 14 months before the funeral, with no note inside the envelope. His brother Gary took the house on Ash Street. His sister Carol took the savings account, $31,440, and the 1994 pickup that still ran. Walter took the land. Nobody argued about it. That was the part Walter kept coming back to, driving west out of town on Farm to Market 194 with the windows down and the afternoon heat coming off the road in waves. Nobody argued. The land had been assessed at $2,100 by the Hale County Appraisal District in 2011, reassessed at $2,100 in 2014, and reassessed again at $2,100 in 2019. 3 assessments, same number, same appraiser's name on all 3 forms. D. Harlow, District Supervisor. Walter had looked at those forms the afternoon before the estate meeting. He had looked at them for a long time. He folded them back into the envelope and put them in the inside pocket of his jacket. He did not say anything about them at the meeting. He signed what he was asked to sign. He shook Gary's hand. He kissed Carol on the cheek. He drove west. The land sat 11 miles outside Plainview, off a county road that turned to Caliche past the second cattle gate. 3 grain silos, Silo 1, Silo 2, Silo 3. His father had never named them anything else. And 42 acres that hadn't produced a commercial crop since 1998. There was a tool shed with a corrugated metal roof that lifted at one corner in high wind. There was a half-mile of cedar post fencing along the north edge that needed work. There was a windmill that turned but didn't pump. And there was Silo 3. Walter parked at the gate and sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off. The wind moved through the grass along the fence line. A scissor-tail flycatcher worked the wire near the road, catching something too small to see from where he was sitting. The sky was the particular hard blue that West Texas gets in October, past the heat of summer, but not yet into the cold. His father had told him, 3 weeks before the first stroke, not to let them fill in the well. Walter had been in Lubbock for a dentist appointment that afternoon. His father called him on the cell phone, which he almost never did, and said it in the way he said most important things. Once, plainly, without explanation. Don't let them fill in the well on that section. Walter had said he wouldn't. He had thought his father meant the old hand-dug well on the southeast corner, the one the county had flagged as a liability in 2009. He understood now that his father had not meant that well. He got out of the truck. Dennis Harlow had come to Walter's mother's house in the summer of 2018, 8 months before Earl Briggs's first stroke, and 4 years after the last assessment. Walter hadn't been there for it. His mother had told him about it that Christmas, the way she told him things, briefly, as something that had already been resolved. A man from the county came about the land. Your father told him it wasn't for discussion. That was all she said. What Walter pieced together later, from talking to two neighbors and from a single note his father had left in the kitchen drawer under the phone book, a torn corner of a paper bag, 3 words in pencil. Harlow. Silo 3, no, was this. The county had wanted the mineral rights to the section. Not the land itself, the mineral rights. The assessment of $2,100 had been the county's opening position in a negotiation his father had refused to have. The note in the kitchen drawer was not addressed to anyone. His mother had put it under the phone book without reading it. She didn't wear her glasses in the kitchen. Walter had taken the note from the drawer and put it in the same envelope with the 3 assessment forms. He walked across the field toward Silo 3. The silos stood in a row along the north edge of the property, each one separated from the next by about 30 feet. The kind of spacing that made sense when you were moving grain by hand. 1 and 2 were identical. 48 feet of corrugated steel, the ventilation caps at the top still turning freely. 3 was different. It had been built later, maybe the early 1950s, from the style of the base, and it sat 8 feet lower than the others. The bottom third sunk into a concrete collar that went below grade. His father had always kept the access ladder on 3 padlocked. 1 and 2 you could climb any time. 3 required the key on the ring Walter was holding. He had never asked about the padlock when his father was alive. You didn't, with Earl Briggs. Not because he was unkind. He wasn't. But because the man communicated primarily through what he left undone and unsaid. And asking him to explain himself directly was like asking someone to translate a language they'd only ever spoken out loud. You learned to read the actions. You learned to watch the hands. Walter stopped at the base of Silo 3. The padlock was a master number 3, the heavy kind, the steel body worn to a dull silver from decades of handling. His father's hands had touched this lock every time he'd come out here. Walter looked at it for a moment without moving. Then he found the right key on the ring. He fitted it. The lock opened. He set the lock on the ground and stood at the bottom of the access ladder with one hand on the rung and looked up. The opening at the top was a circle of that hard blue Texas sky, 61 feet up. The inside of the silo smelled like grain dust and thyme, the particular dry cold that concrete holds even in the heat of a West Texas afternoon. He had a flashlight in his jacket pocket. He had a length of rope he'd stopped to buy at the farm supply store in Plainview on the way out, not knowing why exactly, only knowing that his father had mailed him those keys without a note, and that the last thing his father had said to him about the land was, "Don't let them fill in the well." He started to climb. Here is the thing about Earl Briggs that you need to understand before this story makes any sense at all. He was not a complicated man, in the way that word is usually meant. He didn't read much. He didn't talk about feelings. He fixed what broke, planted what needed planting, paid what he owed, and expected the same from the people around him. He had farmed this section for 40 years in conditions that would have broken most operations, through drought years and commodity crashes and the slow death of the small family farm that took half his neighbors out of business between 1985 and 2000. He had survived all of it. Not comfortably, not without cost, but he had survived. What made Earl Briggs complicated, in the way that actually matters, was the gap between what he said and what he did, between what he let people see and what he was doing in the dark, when no one was watching, when there was nothing to gain from it. Walter knew about some of the gaps. Not all of them. Not yet. He came out here every morning for 11 years after the county posted the assessment. Every morning. Not always for long. Sometimes just long enough to check the locks, walk the fence line, make sure nothing had changed. But every morning. Even the mornings after his wife passed. Even the mornings when the drive out from Lubbock, where he'd retired to be closer to his daughter, was 2.5 hours round trip in the dark. Gary had called it stubborn. Carol had called it morbid. Walter had not called it anything. He just kept coming. He was 67 years old. He had $2,100 and a deed and a set of keys with no note. He climbed. The ladder inside Silo 3 had 31 rungs. Walter counted them on the way up. Not because he needed to, but because counting was something his hands knew how to do when the rest of him was working something out. The interior of the silo was dark past the first 8 feet. He clicked on the flashlight and kept climbing. The beam moved across the curved steel walls, picking up the texture of old grain dust compressed into the corrugations over decades. The faint mineral smell deepening as he went higher. At the top, the ventilation cap let in a thin ring of light around its edge. The wind outside moved the cap in a slow rotation. It made a sound like a playing card against bicycle spokes, quiet and steady. The same sound it had probably been making since 1953. He reached the top platform and stood there for a moment with one hand on the safety rail. From up here he could see the whole section, the fence line running north to south, Silo 1 and 2 to his left, the tool shed with its lifted corner of roofing, the Caliche Road back to Farm to Market 194, the flatland running west to the horizon without interruption, the way West Texas land always runs, as if the earth decided somewhere around here that it was finished with variation. He could also see, from up here, something he had not been able to see from the ground. The floor of Silo 3 was not flat. He had been in Silo 1 and 2 100 times. The floors were poured concrete, smooth and level, the standard construction for grain storage of this era. The floor of 3, visible now when the beam of his flashlight pointed straight down 61 feet, had a ring around its perimeter, a raised collar of concrete, maybe 8 inches high. And inside that collar the floor sat lower than the base of the silo wall by what looked like 1.5 feet, maybe 2 feet. It was, he realized, looking at it from above, shaped less like a grain silo floor and more like a cistern. He stood there for a while, then he climbed back down. He spent the rest of that afternoon doing what he should have done before he ever tried to go up the ladder, walking the base of the silo on the outside, crouching down to look at the concrete collar at grade, checking the seams between the steel shell and the foundation. On the south face, at about knee height, he found something. A steel plate, roughly 12 inches square, bolted to the concrete with 4 bolts. The plate had been painted over the same tan as the lower half of the silo, and the paint had been applied carefully enough that you'd miss it at a casual glance. He had driven past this silo for 11 years and missed it every time. He put his hand on the plate. The bolts were standard hex heads, 5/8 inch. He did not have a socket wrench. He drove back to Plainview. The farm supply store on Broadway closed at 6. He got there at 5:47 and bought a 3/8 inch drive socket set, a ratchet handle, and a tube of penetrating oil. The woman at the register had a name tag that said Patrice.
Just these two items.
She looked at the
today,
socket
please.
set and the penetrating
That will
oil
be $14.50.
and said, "Getting into something that's been closed a while." Walter said yes. "You'll want to let that oil sit overnight," she said. "If the bolts are as old as they look like they might be," he said he knew. He drove back out to the section. He applied the penetrating oil to all 4 bolts on the steel plate, working it into the threads with the tip of the applicator. Then he sat down with his back against the base of the silo and ate the sandwich he'd bought at the gas station that morning and had forgotten about until now. The bread had gone soft in the heat. The turkey inside was fine. He ate it looking west, watching the light change on the flat land as the sun dropped. This was the part nobody understood about Walter Briggs. The stillness. Gary had called it passive. Carol had called it disengaged. His daughter Rachel called it Dad's thing, with the particular affection that covered over something she hadn't quite resolved about him. His wife, Evelyn, who had understood him better than anyone, and who had been gone 3 years now, had called it patience. She had said it the way she said most things, like it was simply true, without editorial. He finished the sandwich and put the wrapper in his jacket pocket and watched the sun go down. He drove back to the motel in Plainview. He hadn't told Rachel he was staying, hadn't wanted to field the questions yet, and sat at the small desk near the window and looked at the 3 assessment forms and the note in pencil for a long time. Harlow, Silo 3. No, the county had been assessing this land at $2,100 for 11 years. The same land, the same number, the same appraiser. In any other circumstance, Walter might have believed it was bureaucratic inertia, the kind of slow institutional forgetting that kept numbers the same across decades, simply because no one had bothered to update them. He had seen that kind of thing. It happened. But the mineral rights inquiry changed the picture. If the county had approached Earl Briggs about mineral rights in 2018, which implied the county believed there was something worth acquiring beneath that section, then the flat assessment was not inertia. It was strategy. Keep the assessed value low enough that the landowner has no financial incentive to resist sale. Make the land look like a burden. Make the offer look like relief. His father had seen through it. His father had written 3 words on a paper bag and put them under the phone book. Walter turned the forms over and looked at the backside of each one. 2 were blank. On the 3rd, in the lower right corner, barely visible where the paper had been folded, there was a faint pencil mark. Not a word, not a number, just a small X. He held the form under the lamp. The X was in his father's hand. He was certain of it. He put the forms back in the envelope and went to sleep. He was back at the silo at 6:48 the next morning with the ratchet handle and a second tube of penetrating oil in case the first application hadn't been enough. It had been enough for 3 of the 4 bolts. The 4th, bottom right corner, had corroded into the threads and required 20 minutes of working the ratchet back and forth in small increments before it broke free. His knuckles hit the concrete twice during the process. He wrapped his hand in the bandana he kept in his back pocket and kept working. The plate came off. Behind it, a steel pipe, roughly 10 inches in diameter, extended horizontally into the concrete base of the silo. The pipe was capped at the outer end with a threaded plug. The plug had a square drive socket on its face, the kind that required a specific driver, not a standard ratchet. Someone had built this to require the right tool to open. Walter looked at the key ring. Among the keys his father had mailed him, the padlock key he'd already used, 2 keys he'd identified as belonging to the tool shed, 1 small key he hadn't placed yet. There was a short steel tool he had initially taken for an oddly shaped bottle opener, flat on one end, square drive on the other. He had looked at it several times over the past 14 months and not known what it was for. He fitted the square drive into the face of the pipe plug. The plug turned, not easily. It took both hands and his full body weight leaning into the tool before it broke the initial seal. But it turned, and once it broke free it came smoothly, the threads clean and well made. One of those objects that had been built carefully enough that 30 years inside a concrete base hadn't degraded it. He unscrewed the plug and set it on the ground. The pipe was dry inside, no water, no sediment. The air that came out was cool and carried the faint smell of metal and something else. Paper, he thought. Dry paper. The particular smell of documents in a sealed space. He got the flashlight from his jacket and shone it into the pipe. At the back of the pipe, maybe 18 inches in from the opening, there was a steel box, roughly the size of a shoebox, fitted to the interior of the pipe closely enough that it would have to be pulled out rather than falling freely. He could see a steel handle on the near face of the box, a simple D-ring welded to the front panel. He reached in and took hold of the D-ring. The box was heavy, heavier than he expected. He had to adjust his grip and use his elbow on the edge of the pipe opening to get the leverage to pull it out. It came with a slight metallic resistance, a gasket seal around the rim, he realized, seeing it now that the box was in his hands. The box had been sealed against moisture. He set it on the ground in front of him. It was a standard steel document box, the kind sold in office supply stores in the 1980s, painted the dark green that almost everything made of steel in that era was painted. There was a latch on the front and a keyhole in the latch. He looked at the key ring again, the small key he hadn't placed. He fitted it to the keyhole. It fit. He did not open the box. He sat back on his heels and looked at the box for a moment. The scissortail was back on the fence line, or a different one, working the wire. The wind moved through the grass. The morning was still cool enough that his breath showed faintly. His father had built a sealed steel access pipe into the base of a grain silo sometime in the early 1990s from the look of the construction, had machined a custom drive tool and included it on a key ring he mailed to his son without a note, 14 months before dying. Had written 3 words on a scrap of paper and put them under the phone book. He had not told Walter any of this directly, not once. Walter picked up the box and carried it to the truck. He did not open it there at the section. He drove back to the motel in Plainview and set the box on the desk and looked at it for a while. He called Rachel in Lubbock, not to tell her about the box, not yet, but because he hadn't talked to her in 4 days and she would be starting to worry. "You still out at the section?" she asked. "Still here," he said. "How is it?" He looked at the box on the desk. "There's a lot to look at," he said. She was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was deciding whether to push. She decided not to. "Okay," she said. "Call me tonight." He said he would. After he hung up, he sat in the chair by the desk and put his hand flat on the top of the box. The steel was cool. The paint was intact except for a small area near the corner of the lid where something had rubbed against it, worn through to bare metal. The bare metal had no rust. The seal had held. He thought about his father mailing those keys. He had received the envelope on a Tuesday in September, 14 months before the funeral. Just the keys, no note, in a padded mailer with his Lubbock address written in his father's careful block printing. He had called his father to ask about it, and his father had said, "You'll know when you need them." Walter had not pushed. You didn't with Earl Briggs. He thought about the X on the back of the assessment form, the one in the lower right corner of the third form, the 2019 assessment. His father had received that form, had turned it over, had made a small pencil mark on the back of it, and had filed it. Whether the X meant agreement or refusal or just acknowledgement, Walter could not say. His father was not alive to say. What he could say was this: a man who went to the trouble of building a sealed pipe into a grain silo foundation, machining a custom tool for the access plug, sealing a document box against moisture, and mailing the keys to his son without explanation, that man was not being careless. That man was being precise. The precision was the message. Walter opened the box. What he found inside wasn't what I expected when he first told me about it. But looking back now, sitting with everything that came after, the calls to the state land office, the survey team, the letter from the attorney in Amarillo, the afternoon in Harlow's office when the room went very quiet. It was the only arrangement that could have worked, the only one his father could have trusted to hold together after he was gone. It was a Tuesday in the second week of October when Walter drove to the county courthouse and asked to see the mineral survey records for Hale County, Section 47, the section his father had farmed. The woman at the records desk, her name was Luann. She had worked there since 1994. She told him this without being asked, looked up the section number in the index, and then looked at her screen for a moment with an expression Walter could not read. "Those records are being reviewed," she said. "What does that mean?"
I'm sorry, there is no record
"It means they're not
here.
available for public access at this time." "How long have they been under review?" Luann looked at her screen again. "Since 2019, she said. Walter stood at the counter. He was aware of his own hands on the counter surface, the way his father had been aware of his hands, as instruments, as the part of the body that did the actual work of the world. "Is there someone I can speak to about the review?" he asked. "You'd want to talk to the district supervisor," Luann said.
Over there.
"That would be Mr. Harlow." Walter said he understood. He did not go to see Harlow that afternoon. He drove back out to the section and walked the fence line. The full perimeter, all four sides, something he hadn't done in months. The north fence needed work in 3 places where the cedar posts had heaved in the last freeze cycle. The east fence was solid. The south fence had a section of wire that had rusted through at a staple and needed replacing. He made notes on a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket, writing down each location with a reference marker, the way his father had taught him. When he was done, he stood at the southeast corner of the section, where the old hand-dug well sat behind its county-mandated orange safety fence, and looked at the flat land running in every direction. There was a man in Plainview named Gene Faust, who had farmed the adjacent section to the east for 38 years. Gene was 74, recently widowed, and had known Earl Briggs since before Walter was born. Walter had called him from the motel that morning, and Gene had said, "Come by for coffee any time," the way Gene said most things, like the offer had been standing since before it was made. Walter drove to Gene's place. Gene Faust's kitchen smelled like coffee and the particular smell of a farmhouse kitchen in October, something seasonal and warm that Walter associated with his parents' house and with no other place on earth. Gene poured 2 cups without asking and sat down across the table.
It's
You
about
found
the
something,
land, Walter.
Jean said. It wasn't a question.
It's always been
Walter
about
looked at the coffee
land.
cup. I think so, he said. Jean nodded. He was a big man, gone soft in the way that working men go soft after they stop working, but with the hands still, the large, deliberate hands of someone who had spent decades moving heavy things carefully. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at the table.
It's a hard call to make, Gene.
Your dad talked to me once,
but you're not
Jean
alone
said.
in this.
Once in 40 years he said anything about that south silo. Maybe 2017. The winter before the trouble with his blood pressure. We were fixing fence between the sections. He stopped in the middle of running a wire and said to me, Gene, if anything happens to me before Walter gets out here, you tell him the answer to the county's question is in the question itself. Walter was still.
I can tell you about.
I didn't know what it meant, Jean said. I wrote it down when I got home. I've still got it. I thought maybe someday you'd come by. He got up and went to the counter and opened a drawer and came back with a folded piece of paper. An actual piece of paper, torn from a notepad, Jean's handwriting in blue ballpoint. The answer to the county's question is in the question itself. He set it on the table between them. Walter looked at it for a long time. Jean drank his coffee. Outside, a pair of sandhill cranes worked across the field in the middle distance, their movements deliberate and unhurried, the way cranes always move when they are not alarmed. He knew Harlow was going to come back, Walter said. I think he knew, Jean said. I think he'd been knowing for a while. Walter took the piece of paper and folded it and put it in the envelope with the assessment forms and the penciled note and the X on the back of the 2019 form. Jean refilled both cups without asking. They sat there for another 40 minutes, not talking much, in the way that two men who have both recently lost people sit together, not for what is said, but for what doesn't need to be. When Walter left, Jean walked him to the truck. At the driver's door, he stopped and put his hand on Walter's shoulder for a moment. One brief, deliberate contact, and then dropped it. Your dad was a careful man, Jean said. He was,
Your father would have wanted you to
Careful
have
men
it.
leave things in the right place, Jean said. You just have to be patient enough to find them. Walter drove back to the section. What Walter Briggs found inside that steel box was not what any of us expected. But his father had not been building a mystery. He had been building something that would still be true after he was no longer there to say it. The letter was one page. His father had written it by hand, in pencil, on a sheet of plain white paper, not letterhead, not a legal pad, just a sheet of copy paper from the ream he kept in the drawer of his desk in the farm office. The writing was careful and even, the block printing he used for everything. The letters formed with the same deliberate pressure he brought to any task that required precision. Walter read it once, then he read it again. Then he folded it back in thirds and held it against his chest with both hands and sat on the concrete collar at the edge of the opening with his legs hanging over the dark space below and the pressure gauge on the 6-inch pipe reading 47 psi and the ventilation cap turning slowly above him. The letter said 3 things. The first thing it said was practical. The Railroad Commission survey of 1987 covered Section 47 and identified both the gas formation and, in a footnote on page 11, that the county's subsequent mineral rights inquiry had not referenced the presence of a confined aquifer. His father had hired an independent geologist in 1989, a woman named Vera Okafor out of Lubbock, retired now but still licensed, to survey the aquifer specifically. Vera Okafor's report, which Earl Briggs had paid for out of pocket, and which he alone possessed, had estimated the aquifer at sufficient volume and pressure to supply reliable irrigation water to approximately 200 acres of agricultural land in perpetuity. The test well confirmed it. The well was drilled to 194 feet. The pressure at the wellhead was between 44 and 51 psi, depending on season. The water was clean. The county had been trying to acquire the mineral rights to Section 47 since 2011. The mineral rights inquiry in 2018 had focused on the gas formation. It had not mentioned the aquifer. This was because the county did not know about the aquifer. The Railroad Commission footnote was obscure enough that Harlow had apparently not found it, or had not known what it meant if he had. Only Earl Briggs, Vera Okafor, and now Walter knew the aquifer existed. The second thing the letter said was legal. In September 1991, 2 years after the Okafor survey, Earl Briggs had filed a sealed document with the Hale County District Clerk's Office. Not the appraisal district, not the tax office, the district clerk, under the case reference EB-1991-47. The document was a recorded declaration of water rights, prepared by an attorney in Amarillo named James Calhoun, asserting the landowner's exclusive claim to subsurface water resources on Section 47 under Texas Water Code, Chapter 36. The filing was sealed, meaning it was not publicly searchable in the standard index, but it was legally recorded, and it predated any county mineral rights claim by 20 years. The declaration was not in the steel box. It was in the district clerk's office, where it had been sitting since 1991. In the event this land passes to my son, the letter said, the right to file and enforce that declaration belongs to him. Not to the county, not to anyone who has not read this letter and understood what is beneath this floor. That was how his father wrote, plainly, without ornament, the way he said most important things. The third thing the letter said was the part Walter had to read twice. It said, "Walter, I know you came out here every morning. Jean told me. I could not tell you why to keep coming. I needed you to come because you decided to come, not because I asked you to. That is the difference. A man who keeps faith because he is told to is obeying. A man who keeps faith because he has decided to is something else. You kept faith with this land for 11 years without knowing what it held. That is what I needed to know before I could give you what is under this floor. Now I know it. So do you. Earl Briggs." October 14th, 2019. October 14th, 2019 was the date of the third assessment form, the one with the X on the back. Walter sat on the concrete collar for a long time. The light in the silo had changed while he was reading. The column from the ventilation cap was lower now, the afternoon moving west, the angle of the light through the cap shallowing toward evening. The scissor tail was gone from the fence. The wind had dropped. He looked at his father's name at the bottom of the letter. Earl Briggs, written the same way he signed checks and tax forms and the deed to the section when he bought it in 1971. The two words, no flourish, the name of a man who had decided at some point that his signature was not an opportunity for self-expression. Walter refolded the letter. He put it back in the white envelope. He put the envelope in his shirt pocket against his chest. He looked at the pressure gauge one more time, 47 pounds per square inch. Then he climbed out of the access space and put the steel plate back over the opening and went to find the attorney in Amarillo. The office of James Calhoun and Associates on Tyler Street in Amarillo occupied the second floor of a building that had been a bank in a previous life, with the kind of high ceilings and heavy woodwork that banks used to commission when they wanted to look permanent. James Calhoun himself was 81 years old,
The terms
thin
of your
and
uncle's
precise,
will are
with
quite
the manner of a man who had
specific,
spent
Walter.
60 years
They
being careful
require
with language
strict
and
compliance.
had no intention of stopping. He remembered Earl Briggs. He did not say this with particular sentiment. He said it the way he said most things, as information delivered accurately.
1960.
Your father came to me in the summer of 1991, Calhoun said. He had a geologist's report and a railroad commission survey
terms
and a
of the
very
will
clear
are
idea
quite
of what he wanted
specific.
done. He was not a man
Regarding
who
the
required a great
distribution of
deal
the
of
estate.
explanation once he had decided on a course of action. What was the course of action? Walter
Tell
asked.
me the truth about the estate.
He wanted the water rights recorded and
father
sealed
really
before
leave
the county
everything
had
to
any
her?
reason to look for them, Calhoun said. His concern, which I shared and
The
still
county
share,
filings
was
must
that
be
an open
completed by
filing would
Friday.
prompt a competing
cannot
claim
afford
before
any
he was
further
ready
delays.
to act on the rights himself. So we filed under seal. The filing is valid. It predates any
The
subsequent county
documents
claim by
confirm
a
it.
significant margin. The water
You
rights
are the
belong to the
sole
landowner
owner.
of Section 47. He paused. Which is now you. Walter looked at his hands on the arm of the chair. What are they worth? He asked. Calhoun looked at him over the rim of his glasses. That depends on how they're used, he said. The aquifer your father
This
surveyed is a
clause
confined
outlines
formation.
the
It's not part of the
distribution of the
Ogallala. It's a separate
primary
system
estate.
entirely. The Ogallala
You
has been declining
understand
at
the
measurable
terms?
rates for decades. A reliable, confined aquifer in Hale County, with documented pressure and volume, properly managed, is worth considerably more than the agricultural land above it. He paused again. Considerably more. Walter said, How considerably? Calhoun opened the file on his desk and turned 3 pages and read a figure aloud. The figure was $2,847,000. That was the low end of the independent appraisal Calhoun had commissioned in 2021 at Earl Briggs's instruction, to be held in the file until needed. The high end, under certain development scenarios, was $4.1 million. Walter did not say anything for a moment. Your father asked me to commission the appraisal 2 years before he died.
Is that all
Calhoun
they
said.
left?
He said he wanted you to have a number when you came in. He said you would need a number to make the first decision clearly. What's the first decision? Walter asked.
Is that all they left?
Whether to sell the rights or retain them, Calhoun said. And if you retain them, to whom and under what terms you make the water available. He closed the file. Your father had opinions about that. He wrote them down. They're in the file. Walter sat in the chair in the office that used to be
will
a
is
bank
quite
and looked at the
specific,
heavy woodwork
Walter.
and the high ceiling
The
and the
land
afternoon light
remains
coming
with the
through the tall
estate.
windows, and did not speak for a while. He thought about 11 years of mornings, the drive out in the dark, the walk to the silo, the fence line, the tool shed, the windmill that turned but didn't pump, the assessments at $2,100. He thought about Harlow's office in the courthouse, the records under review since 2019, the mineral rights inquiry his father had refused. He thought about his father's hands on the padlock of Silo 3, the hands that
This
had built the
agreement
cap,
doesn't
drilled
change
the
my
well,
mind.
drawn the map, written the
I
letter,
intend to claim
sealed
what
the
is
box,
rightfully
sent the
mine.
keys. He thought about the letter in his shirt pocket. A man who keeps faith because he has decided to is something else. He looked at Calhoun. Show me what he wrote, Walter said. If you have made it this far into Walter's story, hit subscribe, because what his father wrote in that file is the part I have been waiting to tell you. Calhoun opened the second folder and removed 2 pages written in the same block printing, on the same plain white paper. Earl Briggs had prepared this document in March 2021, 8 months before the second stroke that ended his ability to write. The heading at the top, underlined once, read, "My intentions for the water." Walter read it at the desk in Calhoun's office, with Calhoun sitting quietly on the other side of the desk, not reading along, looking at the window. The document was not legally binding. Earl Briggs had been clear about that with Calhoun. He did not want to constrain his son with conditions attached to the inheritance, because conditions attached to inheritance were, in his view, a way of controlling from the grave, and he had no interest in that. What he had written was a record of what he had intended, offered to Walter as information rather than instruction. What he had intended was this. In Hale County, in the years between 1985 and 2000, 31 farming operations had failed. Earl Briggs had known most of them. Some were neighbors. Some were men he had done business with for decades. Some had simply sold under pressure when the combination of commodity prices and drought made continuing untenable. A few had held on through means he respected, and a few through means he did not, but all of them, in the end, had gone. Of those 31 operations, 11 had been sold to entities that Earl Briggs described in his document with characteristic plainness as not farmers. Investment groups, holding companies, a land bank out of Dallas that had acquired 4 contiguous sections and leased them back to contract operators. By 2019, those 11 former farming operations covered 4,847 acres of Hale County agricultural land. None of them had water. The Ogallala aquifer beneath that land had been declining at a rate of approximately 2 feet per year since 1980. The irrigation capacity of the affected sections had dropped to roughly 60% of what it had been in Earl Briggs's early farming years. The holding companies and investment groups had modeled this into their acquisition prices. They had not told the contract operators who farmed the land for them. Earl Briggs had been watching this for 30 years. What he had written, in the plain block printing he used for everything that mattered, was a list. 11 names. The 11 families who had sold their operations between 1985 and 2000, and who, to his knowledge, were still in Hale County, or the adjacent counties. Not the holding companies, not the investment groups, the families. Below the list, in the same careful hand, was a single paragraph. Walter read it twice. The water under this section is not mine. I found it, and I secured it, and I held it long enough to pass it forward. But it was here before I was, and it will be here after Walter is gone, if it is managed correctly. What I want, if Walter decides to develop the water rights, is for the first right of access, at a fair but not commercial price, to go to the families on this list. Not charity, fair price. The difference is dignity. Below the paragraph, his father had written one more line. I was not able to give them back what they lost. This is what I have instead. Walter set the pages down on Calhoun's desk. Calhoun was still looking at the window. He had read this document before. He did not need to read it again. The afternoon light in the office had gone golden, the particular quality of October light in the Texas Panhandle, low and long and without ambiguity, the light of a season that knows it is almost finished. It came through the tall windows and lay across the desk and across the 2 pages of plain white paper with his father's block printing, and across Walter's hands resting on the desk surface. Walter looked at the list of 11 names. He knew 4 of them. two from childhood, families who had farmed neighboring sections when he was growing up, whose kids he had gone to school with. One from later, a man named Dorsey Hutchins, who had sold in 1997 and moved to Tulia, and whom Walter had run into at the Plainview Farm Bureau meeting 3 years ago, briefly in the parking lot, and one he had not expected. The fourth name on the list was Gene Faust. Walter looked at it for a moment. Gene Faust had not sold his section. Gene was still farming, or had been until recently. He looked at the date next to Gene's name, 1992,
The execution of the estate will
and
take
the notation his father had written
6
beside
months.
it. Sold mineral rights
Provided
only,
there are no
under pressure,
delays with the
did not
liquidation.
sell land. Regrets it. Gene had known what it meant to be pressured by the county. He had sold what he had to sell and kept what he could keep. He had told Walter, "Your dad was a careful man." He had not said, "Your dad was trying to fix what happened to me." Walter sat with that for a moment. Then he looked at Calhoun. "How long to file the enforcement claim on the water rights?" he asked. 3 to 4 weeks to prepare the filing properly, Calhoun said. Once filed, the county has 30 days to respond. Given the sealed 1991 declaration, their options are limited. We are not in a weak
This
position.
arrangement is fine.
And Harlow? Calhoun looked at him over his glasses again. Mr. Harlow has been district supervisor since 2009, he said carefully. The 2011 assessment, the 2014 assessment, and the 2019 assessment were all conducted under his supervision. The mineral rights inquiry in 2018 was conducted under his supervision. Whether those actions constitute impropriety under Texas law is a matter I would want to review carefully before characterizing. He paused. But I would want to review it. Walter nodded. He picked up the 2 pages of his father's document
Is
and
that all
squared
we
them
have?
against the desk and slid them back across to Calhoun. "Keep those in the file," he said. "I'll need them." He stood up. He put on his jacket. He
Is
put his
that all
hand
we
in his
have?
shirt pocket and felt the envelope there. The white envelope with his name on it, folded in thirds. "One more thing," he said. "When my father came to you in
It's a complicated
1991,
matter,
was he
Walter.
confident this would work? The sealed filing, the long wait, all of it?" Calhoun considered the question. He was not a man who expressed confidence or doubt in those terms, Calhoun said. What he said, when we finished the filing and I asked him what he intended to do next, was, "I intend to farm," and he did. Walter drove back to the section. He drove out Farm to Market 194 as the last of the October light was leaving the sky, the horizon line going from gold to amber to a deep, clear dark, the kind of dark that comes to flat country with nothing between it and the edge of the world. He turned onto the Caliche Road past the second cattle gate and drove slowly over the ruts and stopped at the fence. He got out and stood at the gate. The 3 silos were dark shapes against the sky. The windmill turned in the evening wind, a slow, steady rotation, the vanes catching the last of the light. The tool shed was a low shape to the east. The fence line ran north to south into the dark. He stood there for a while. Then he went to see Dennis Harlow. Harlow's office in the county courthouse was on the 2nd floor, north side, overlooking the parking lot and the war memorial and the live oaks that the city had planted along the sidewalk in 1987 and that were now large enough to shade the whole east side of the building. Walter had been in this office twice before. Once when he was 12 with his father for a reason he no longer remembered, And once in 2014, when he had come to ask about the second assessment and been told it was a standard reevaluation process. Harlow was a heavy man, late 50s, with the particular physical solidity of someone who has spent a career sitting in judgment of other people's problems. He had the kind of office that accumulates itself over decades. Certificates on the wall, plaques, the detritus of institutional tenure arranged with the care of a man who needed the room to confirm what he was. He looked up when Walter came in, and his expression did not change. "Mr. Briggs," he said, "I heard you were in town." Walter sat down without being asked. He put the envelope, the larger envelope, the one with the 3 assessment forms and Jean's note and the X on the back of the 2019 form, on the desk between them. He did not say anything. Harlow looked at the envelope.
I know how this looks, Dennis.
He looked at the envelope again. The mineral rights inquiry from 2018 is still open, Harlow said. If you're here about that, I'm not here about the mineral rights, Walter said. Harlow was quiet. I filed this morning with the district clerk's office, Walter said. Enforcement of a recorded water rights declaration, case reference EB-1991-47. You'll receive the county's copy in the next few days. Harlow looked at him. He did not say anything for a long time. He picked up a pen from the desk and turned it in his hand. He set it down. He looked at the envelope on the desk between them.
For him, Walter.
He looked at the window.
The board
he looked at his
find
hands.
out sooner or later.
He did not look at Walter. The assessment records for Section 47 are under review, he said finally. Not as a threat, not as an explanation, as a statement of fact, the way a man restates something he has said before when he does not know what else to say. Walter stood up. I know, he said. He picked up the envelope and walked out. He did not look back at Harlow. He did not need to. He had seen, in the moment before he stood, in the moment when Harlow looked at his hands and did not look up, the expression of a man who has spent 11 years being certain and has just understood, without being told directly, that the certainty was misplaced. Not guilt, not remorse. Something smaller and harder than either of those things. The look of a man doing arithmetic in his head and not liking the answer. Harlow would not apologize. Walter did not expect him to. Men like Harlow, men who had spent decades constructing a system of justifications for the decisions they had made, did not arrive at apology through a single conversation. What they arrived at, eventually, was the arithmetic. The quiet, private arithmetic of consequence. Walter left him to it. He walked down the courthouse stairs and out through the main doors and stood for a moment on the steps in the October afternoon, under the live oaks that had been planted the same year his father had hired Vera Okafor to survey the aquifer. The light through the oak leaves made a pattern on the sidewalk that shifted in the wind. He put his hand in his shirt pocket and felt the letter there. A man who keeps faith because he has decided to is something else.
Single day.
He had driven out to that section every morning for 11 years because he had decided to. Not because he was asked. Not because he understood why. Because his father had mailed him a set of keys without a note, and something in Walter Briggs, some knowledge that lived below the level of language, in the hands and the habit and the long practice of paying attention, had understood that the keys meant keep coming. That was what his father had needed to know. The state review of the Hale County Appraisal District's mineral rights assessments for Section 47 was opened in December, 2 months after Walter filed the water rights enforcement claim. It was not opened at Walter's request. It was opened because James Calhoun's filing had cross-referenced the 1991 sealed declaration against the 3 subsequent assessments and the Railroad Commission's 1987 survey, and the resulting discrepancy between what the county knew was beneath Section 47 and what it had been assessing the land at for 11 years was the kind of discrepancy that generates its own momentum once it is in writing. Walter did not attend the review proceedings. He was not required to. He was the claimant, not the subject. He went home to Lubbock and had dinner with Rachel and did not tell her everything at once, because there was too much to tell at once, and he had his father's habit of saying things once and plainly when they were ready to be said. He told her about the silo first, then the well,
I spoke
the
to
letter.
Mr. Harrison about
She sat at the
fence.
kitchen table and listened without interrupting, the way she had learned to listen to him over 40 years of being his daughter. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He knew you'd come every morning." "He found out," Walter said. "Jean told him." Rachel looked at the table. She had her mother's hands, the same shape,
We need
the
to
same
settle
way of
this
resting them
before it
flat
is
against
too
a
late.
surface when she was thinking. "He waited until he knew," she said. "Yes," Walter said. She looked up. "How does it feel?" Walter thought about it. "Like something that was already true finally has a name," he said. He drove out to the section the next morning, and the morning after that. The difference now was that he knew what he was keeping faith with, which was both more and less than the mystery had been. The mystery had required him to trust without knowing. The knowledge required him to decide. He
You know
spent 3
exactly
weeks
what
making
that
the
key
decision.
is for.
He walked the fence. He sat in the silo with
can't
the plate
afford to
off
wait.
and looked at the pressure gauge. He drove to Tulia and found Dorsey Hutchins and sat with him for an hour in a diner on the main street and told him about the list his father had left. Dorsey Hutchins was 69 years old and had been running a parts counter at a farm equipment dealership since 1998. He had sold the Hutchins section, 320 acres, 4 miles north of Walter's property, in 1997 for $180,000 to a land investment group out of Lubbock that had resold it 3 times since. He listened to Walter without speaking. At the end, he looked out the window of the diner for a long time.
We can't afford to make any
"Your
more
dad
mistakes.
put us on a list," he said. "Yes," Walter said. "Why?" Dorsey asked. Not why did he care. He understood why Earl Briggs might have cared. He meant, why us specifically? Why this? Why now? Why through a silo in the ground instead of a conversation over a fence? Walter thought about the letter, about the third thing it said, about faith and decision. "Because he couldn't give back what you lost," Walter said. This was what he had instead. Dorsey looked at him for a moment. He did not say anything. He picked up his coffee cup and set it down. He looked out the window again. He did not look back at Walter for almost a full minute. When he did, his jaw was set, and he was looking at the table between them.
It is a
"Fair
long
price,"
way down.
he said quietly. The words from his father's document, which Walter had shared with him. Not charity. Fair price. "Fair price," Walter said. Dorsey nodded once, looked at the window, looked at his hands. Walter left him sitting there. He drove back to the section on Farm to Market 194 with the windows down, the November air coming in cold now, the first cold of the season, the kind of cold that has weight to it after the long Texas summer. He turned onto the Caliche Road and drove to the gate and sat in the truck with the engine off. The section was quiet. The windmill turned. The silos stood in a row against the sky. the ventilation caps making their slow rotations in the wind, the same sound they had made for 70 years. He thought about his father standing at this gate. How many thousand mornings, the same flat land, the same sky, the same silos, knowing what was underneath and saying nothing. Farming the cracked hardpan for 40 years on a section the county had decided was worth $2,100. Writing a list of names on plain white paper in 2021 and asking Calhoun to keep it in a file. He thought about the X on the back of the 2019 assessment form. His father receiving that form, reading the number, $2,100, the same number for the third time, the same appraiser's name, and turning it over and making a small pencil mark on the back. Not anger, not a protest, just acknowledgement. A man marking a document the way he had marked survey forms and fence maps and tax records for 40 years. Carefully, precisely, leaving the mark where it could be found by the right person. Found by the only person he had trusted for 11 years to keep coming. The meeting happened on a Saturday in February, 4 months after Walter filed the enforcement claim, and 6 weeks after the state review of the Hale County Appraisal District had concluded its preliminary findings. Walter had not organized it. Gene Faust had. Gene had called him on a Tuesday evening in January and said he was thinking about having people over for lunch on a Saturday and asked if Walter could come. Walter said yes. Gene said he'd invited a few others. Walter asked who. Gene said some people who knew Earl. Walter said, all right. He drove out from Lubbock on a Saturday morning in February with the sky the particular flat white of a West Texas winter. Not threatening, just closed, the light diffuse and without shadow. The kind of sky that makes the land look larger than it does in summer, because there is nothing to define the distance. He turned onto Gene's Road at 11:14 in the morning. There were 11 vehicles in Gene's yard. Walter sat in the truck for a moment looking at them. A collection of pickups and older sedans, the kind of vehicles that accumulate in a farm family yard over decades. Not new, not identical, each one carrying the particular wear of use. He recognized Gene's truck. He recognized the blue Silverado that belonged to Dorsey Hutchins, who had driven up from Tulia. He did not recognize the others. He got out and went inside. Gene's kitchen table had been extended with a folding table along one side, covered with a tablecloth that Walter recognized as having belonged to Gene's wife, who had been gone 2 years. The room smelled like coffee and something baked, and the particular warmth of a house where people have been gathering since early morning. There were people standing at the counter, sitting at the table, leaning in the doorway to the living room. Walter counted 9 people before Gene came out of the back of the house and crossed the room and took his hand. "Glad you came," Gene said. "Who are these people?" Walter asked quietly. Gene looked at the room. 4 of the 11, he said. Rest of them are family members. 1 son, 2 daughters, 1 widow. He paused. The widow is Marlene Hutchins, Dorsey's mother. She's 83. Dorsey drove her up this morning.
I'm Walter
Walter looked
Briggs,
across the
ma'am.
room at the woman sitting at the far end of the extended table. She was small and
I'm truly
straight-spined,
sorry for
with
your
white
loss,
hair and the
Marlene.
hands of someone who had worked outdoors for most of her life. She was looking at Walter. He crossed the room and introduced himself. Marlene Hutchins had sold the Hutchins section with her husband
Do you
in
really
1997,
mean what you're
the year
saying,
before he
Walter?
died. She had been living in
I
Tulia
need
since
to know
then,
the
in a house on the
absolute
east side of
truth.
town that her daughter helped her maintain. She was clear-eyed and direct, and she looked at Walter the
Do
way
you
people of her
really mean
generation
what
looked
you're
at you
saying,
when they were
Walter?
deciding whether you meant what you said.
I need to know the absolute
Your father came to see us
truth.
in 1996, she said. The year before we sold. He came to tell us not to sell to the
Your
group from
father
Lubbock.
was a stubborn
She paused.
man, Walter.
We sold anyway.
But he had a
We
good
needed
heart.
to. I know, Walter said. He wasn't angry about it, she said. He
Your
understood
father
why
was
we
a
did.
stubborn man,
He just wanted
Walter.
us to know there might be
But he
another
had a
way.
good heart.
She looked at her hands on the table. We didn't know about the
sat
water.
right
He
here
didn't
at
tell
this
us
table.
about the water.
You gave me
He
your
couldn't tell
word
anyone, Walter
that
said.
you would take
Not
care
until the
of it.
filing was solid. I understand that now, she said. I understood
We
it when
sat
Dorsey
right
told
here
me.
at this table.
She looked up at him.
You gave me
I
your
kept thinking
word
about him
that
coming
you
out to
would
our
take
place
care
that
of it.
afternoon. Just showing up, not calling ahead, the way people
We
used
sat
to
right
do.
here at
She
this
paused.
table.
He
You
sat
gave
at our
me your
kitchen table
word
for 40
that you would
minutes
take
and
care
drank
of it.
coffee and said what he had to say, and then he drove home. He didn't ask us for anything. He just came. Walter sat down
Can't
across
wait
from
for
her.
them.
The room around them had gotten louder, more people talking, Jean directing traffic from the kitchen, someone's daughter helping carry food from the counter to the table. But at this end of the table, it was quiet. He was like that, Walter said. I know, Marlene said. That's why I've been thinking about it for 26 years. She said it plainly, without sentiment, in the way of someone reporting an accurate fact. 26 years. The way a thing stays with you when you can't put it down. A man named Curtis Webb had driven over from Canyon, 40 miles, where he had been running a feed and supply store since selling his section in 1994. He was 67, the same age as Walter, with the square build of someone who had spent his 20s doing physical labor and had never entirely stopped. He found Walter at the table after Marlene had moved away to talk to Jean, and sat down without preamble. I didn't know your dad well, Curtis said. We weren't neighbors. I knew him by a reputation. What was his reputation? Walter asked. Curtis thought about it. Man who paid what he owed, he said. Man who kept his fence. He paused. People used to say he was cold. I never thought he was cold. I thought he just didn't have patience for things that weren't what they appeared to be. He looked at the table. I heard what he left, the list, what he intended. He looked up. He must have been thinking about it for a long time. Since at least 1991, Walter said. Curtis was quiet for a moment. That's 30 years, he said. Yes, Walter said. Curtis looked at his hands. My daddy lost that section in 1994, he said. We didn't talk about it much after. It was a thing that happened and you moved forward. But it was always there. He paused. My daddy died in 2011. He never stopped thinking it was his fault, that he should have done something different. He looked up. If he'd known someone had been watching, had been thinking about it all that time. He stopped. He looked at the window. He did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. A woman named Patricia Engel had driven over from Lubbock with her daughter. Patricia had inherited her section from her parents in 1991 and sold it in 1993, when the combination of drought and commodity prices had made the math impossible. She was 64, a retired school administrator, and she had the manner of someone who had spent a career managing difficult situations with composure. She sat down next to Walter after the food was served and told him something he had not known. She said that in the summer of 1993, the week after she had signed the papers selling the section, Earl Briggs had come to her door. He had stood on her porch, not asking to come in, not staying long, and said two things. He had said, "That was the right decision, given what you knew." And he had said, "I'm sorry there wasn't another option." She had not understood, until now, what the second thing meant. He was apologizing, she said, not for anything he'd done, for the fact that he hadn't figured out the water rights in time to give us another option. She paused. The filing was 1991. We sold in 1993. 2 years wasn't enough time to do anything with it. Walter looked at his coffee cup. He told me he wasn't able to give back what you'd lost, he said. He said the water was what he had instead. Patricia was quiet. He carried that, she said, not a question. I think so, Walter said, for a long time. She looked across the room to where Jean was standing at the counter, talking to Dorsey Hutchins. She looked at the tablecloth that had belonged to Jean's wife. She looked at the people around the extended table, the 4 families and their children and 1 widow, gathered in a farmhouse kitchen in February because a man they had known at a distance had spent 30 years thinking about what he owed them. He couldn't have known it would be enough, she said. When he set it up in 1991, he couldn't have known if the water would matter by the time anyone found it. No, Walter said, he couldn't. But he did it anyway, she said. Walter looked at his hands on the table, the hands that had pulled the steel plate off the floor of Silo 3, that had fitted the square drive tool into the pipe plug, that had felt the pressure of deep water through 30 years of sealed steel. He did it anyway, Walter said. Jean put food on the table at 12:30, a pot of chili he had started the night before, cornbread, a bowl of sliced tomatoes from someone's preserved summer garden, 2 pies that a woman named Beverly had brought without being asked. Jean was a competent cook, in the practical way of a man who has been feeding himself for 2 years and has resolved to do it properly. The chili was good. The cornbread was good. Nobody mentioned the food much, because the food was not the point. They sat at the extended table in Jean's kitchen, 11 people, 4 families, 1 widow, and ate and talked and did not talk, in the rhythm of a meal that is not really about the food. At one point, Beverly, who had been a neighbor of the Faust family for 40 years, and who had come because Jean had called her, and she had not known Earl Briggs well, but had known of him, said something that stopped the table for a moment. She said, "I keep thinking about how he never told anyone." The table was quiet. "Not in 30 years, she said. He knew what was under that section. He knew what it was worth. He went out every morning," she looked at Walter. "I mean, he went out, same as you, just went out and did what needed doing, and never said a word to anybody." She shook her head slightly, not in judgment, in something closer to wonder. "My husband would have told someone," she said. "He wouldn't have been able to stand it. He would have told someone inside of a week." She paused. "Some people can hold things, just hold them and go about their work." Jean looked at the table. Dorsey Hutchins looked at the window. Marlene, at the far end of the table, had her hands folded and was looking at the tablecloth. It was Marlene who spoke. "He told Walter," she said. The table was quiet. "Not in words," she said, "but he told him." She looked at Walter with the same clear-eyed directness she had used when he first crossed the room to her. "He sent the keys. That was him telling you." Walter looked at the tablecloth. The tablecloth had a pattern of small blue flowers repeated at regular intervals across a cream ground. Jean's wife had used it for company. Jean had kept it folded in the drawer and taken it out this morning because today was company. Walter thought about the keys and the padded mailer, his father's block printing on the address label. No note. He thought about what Marlene had said. That was him telling you. He thought about his father's hands, the same hands that had built the cap, and drilled the well, and machined the tool, and drawn the map. Those hands had packed the keys into the mailer, and written the address, and sealed it, and taken it to the post office on some Tuesday or Thursday in September 2018, and handed it across the counter, and driven back to the section. The same hands, doing the same work, paying what he owed. After the meal, people gathered their coats and said their goodbyes slowly, the way people leave when they are not quite ready to leave, in stages, in small clusters, with pauses at the door. Dorsey helped his mother to the Silverado. Patricia Engel and her daughter stood with Jean in the yard for 15 minutes, talking about something Walter couldn't hear from where he was standing by his truck. Curtis Webb stopped beside him on the way to his vehicle. "What happens next?" Curtis asked. "Not about the legal proceedings, about the water." "We're working out the terms," Walter said. "Calhoun's office is drawing up the access agreements. Fair price." He paused. "It'll take a few months to sort the logistics." Curtis nodded. He looked at the flat, white sky. "My daughter farms," he said. "She leases a section out past Abernathy. She's been watching the Ogallala numbers for 10 years. He paused. "She doesn't say much about it, but she's watching." "Tell her to call Calhoun's office in the spring," Walter said. Curtis looked at him. He looked at the sky. He nodded once, the way men of that generation nodded when something had been settled. Not a performance, just an acknowledgement. He got in his truck and drove out Jean's road toward the highway. Walter was the last to leave. He helped Jean carry the folding table back to the garage and fold up the tablecloth, which Jean did carefully and set back in the drawer where it lived. They stood in Jean's kitchen for a few minutes after, not talking much, drinking the last of the coffee. "He would have liked today," Jean said. "He would have," Walter said. Jean looked at his coffee cup. "He wouldn't have said so," he said, "but he would have." Walter drove home to Lubbock in the late afternoon, the flat white sky beginning to thin at the western horizon where the sun was going down behind it. A faint warmth at the edge of the world. He drove Farm to Market 194, past the county road that turned to Caliche, past the second cattle gate. He did not turn in. He kept driving. He would go back in the morning. He had decided to keep going back in the mornings. Not because there was a mystery anymore, because there was work to do. The access agreements would take months to finalize. The water management plan would take longer. The state review of the appraisal district was ongoing, and its conclusions would require legal attention when they came. There were fence posts that needed replacing on the north side. There was a section of wire on the south fence that had rusted through at a staple. The windmill still turned. It still didn't pump. Walter made a note on the folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket to look into what it would take to fix the windmill. His father had left it turning for 30 years, not pumping. He had left it as it was, neither fixed nor removed. Walter had always assumed this was one of the things that got deferred, one of the small maintenance tasks that accumulated on a working farm and waited for a season that didn't come. He thought about it now as he drove west in the last of the afternoon light, and he understood that his father had left the windmill turning on purpose. A windmill that turns is a sign of life. A windmill that doesn't pump is a sign of patience. His father had been patient for 30 years. Walter could fix the windmill now. There was no reason to leave it the way it was. The patience had served its purpose. The thing it was waiting for had been found. He added a second note on the paper. Ask Rachel to come out next weekend. She would want to see the silo. She would want to stand where her grandfather had stood. She would want to look at the pressure gauge. 47 psi, still holding. The water, still there, still patient, still pressing upward through 194 feet of earth toward whoever had the sense to come looking. He drove west in the thin winter light. The land ran flat in every direction. The sky held its pale, diffuse white from horizon to horizon, featureless and enormous, and indifferent to everything happening beneath it. To the access agreements being drafted in an office on Tyler Street in Amarillo, to the state review proceeding in Austin, to the 11 families, to the one widow sitting in her house in Tulia, thinking about a man who had come to her door in 1993 and said, "I'm sorry, there wasn't another option." To the water under Section 47, pressing upward at 47 psi. Waiting. Walter Briggs had spent 11 years driving to land the county said was worth $2,100. He had come every morning because he had decided to come, not because he had been asked. And what he found, when he finally went deep enough, was not just what his father had left. It was the proof of why his father had left it to him. A farmer knows that what the land holds is not always visible from the surface. Earl Briggs had spent 40 years knowing that. He found a confined aquifer at 194 feet and spent 30 more years holding it in trust for the people who had lost the land above it. Quietly, without credit, in the same direction, because the work was worth doing. Not because someone was watching. The water was always there. It just needed the right person to keep coming until they knew how deep to look. If this story stayed with you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for a new story every week, and leave a comment. Is there something in your own family, a key without a note, a decision that made no sense at the time, that you understand differently now?